Hi guys, in this video we're talking about the for loop. A loop helps you do repeated tasks. For example, if you want to do a line of code 100 times, 1,000 times, or 1,000,000 times, you can simply do it in a loop. There are different types of loop, and one of them is the for loop. In fact, I think the for loop is one of the most frequently used types of loop, and in this video we're going to um, talk about a for loop, and not just a simple for loop. We are going to say everything about a for loop. So I have Visual Studio 2019 here. I create a new project. I choose C# as my language, and here instead of this drop down menu is usually on web, but for this project we need a console project. So I use a console application. Next, I choose a name, for loop, and we don't have to change anything here. Next, we create our project. Okay, so when you start a console application, your entry point into the program is the main method. Main method is where everything starts. So if right now I just run this application, you'll see that after building the application, I can see the the message hello world over here. Okay, so everything is set, we're ready to go. But let's just pose the problem before going to the solution. You want to print lots of numbers on the screen. So the instruction you give the machine is console dot write line, and you give your message. For example, you want to print number 1 on the screen, and then after that number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5, and so on. Okay, so it's 2, 3, 4, and 5. So when you do it for 5 numbers, it doesn't take much time and it's not complicated, it's easy. But what if you want to do it like 1,000 times, 1,000,000 times? You need to have a piece of code that does repeated tasks over and over, and you can control this piece of code easily. This code is called a for loop, and this is how you write it: for parentheses, and you have to give it a counter. This counter is, you can call it anything you want. You can call it I, you can call it counter, you can call it C, or whatever, but for simplicity it's usually given a one-letter name, so it's just a variable of integer type. But it could be anything, you don't have to choose the integer type, but most loops use an integer type for the initializer, and you have to give it an initial value. I give it 1. Then comes the condition. Our condition is that while I is smaller than 100, smaller or equal, and then what? Then increase I 1 at a time. Okay, this is our main line. Let me clean this line, we'll write it again. Okay, so what happens next? We open curly braces, and whatever we put between the curly braces will be repeatedly done by the machine. Okay, for example, here we want the same instruction, that is writing something. Write line, and This is from the for loop. Okay, now let's give it a try. We'll get back to the code and I'll explain everything. Okay, you see that like 100 times the message this is from the for loop is repeated here. But what are these parts? In a for loop, we start with an initializer. Initializer is the part of the code that happens one and only once, and that is giving the first value of the counter. Okay, so this part happens only once. Later I'll show you how it happens. Okay, so we say that we have a variable called I, initialize it by 1, and then comes, after a semicolon, comes the condition. How many times are we going to do this? We're going to do it until I is equal, or we are going to do it until I is equal, before I is equal or smaller than 100. So while I is smaller than 100 or equal 100, this loop is going to go on. Whatever we see between the curly braces is going to happen for 100 times. And what is this message? This says that this tells the machine that every time that the instructions between the curly braces happen, add 1 to I. Okay, so this part adds 1 number to I every time that this curly the instructions between the curly braces happen. This part is called iteration. Iteration is the number of instructions you give the machine and you want the machine to repeat them. Okay, so this is a simple for loop, but there is a benefit in having a variable defined inside the for loop. The benefit is that you can use the variable inside the curly braces, and the for loop will distinguish it and use it in the code. So let's give it a try. Instead of the message I place the letter I, our variable, in the parentheses of right line. So let's see what happens. Okay, so we started with 1 and ended with 100. What happened here? Here we okay, so what happens here? We started with 1 and the condition is true because 1 is smaller than 100, and we go, this part is very important, we go to the loop. Okay, this did not happen yet, so we didn't add 1 to I yet. Okay, we finish the loop, we print the number 1 on the screen, we go back to our condition, but before we go back to the condition, 1 number is added to I, and now I is 2. So is our condition true? Yes, it is. So we do the loop again, we add 1 item to I. We do the loop, 1 item, and another item is added to I. So after, this part is important, after every single time that we go through the curly braces, we add 1 item to I. So this part, the iteration, happens after every time that we go through the loop. But there is another way of doing this. Instead of putting the 2 plus signs after the I place them before the I. Now let's see what happens this time. So you can see that exactly the same thing happened here. So it doesn't matter whether you use the plus signs before I or after I, but that's only for a for loop. There are other cases that this one makes a difference, whether you put the plus signs, the two plus signs before the I, or you place them after the I. Okay, now we can kind of reverse this action. Instead of starting at 1 and ending at 100, you can start with 100 and end the process with 1, but this time we'll do it while I is greater or equal to 1, and this time instead of adding one item every time to I, we are going to use the minus signs and decrease one item from our I. So this time we are going to have 199 and we'll finish with 1. So we started with 100 and we ended with 1. Okay, so our iteration can be something called a prefix or a postfix. So this is a postfix and this is a prefix. But this is not the only instruction we can use as an iteration. You can use assignments. You can use assignments like, for example, instead of I++, we can say that every time I equals I plus 1. So we're going to get exactly the same effect here. Okay, let's change to the first. Okay, now this is what we had first. So we start with 1, we end with 100, and every time we add one item to I, okay, and it's going to work exactly the same way. But what is the difference between these two? Between using an assignment, this is called an assignment because we are assigning the result of a calculation to a variable, and a prefix or a postfix like I++. This is a prefix. This is a postfix I++. Okay, so what is the difference between this and this? With I++, we cannot add two items. We cannot add two items every time we go through the loop. But here, instead of I equals I plus 1, I can use I equals I plus 2, or 3, or 5. Okay? Now, this time we are going to have 1, 6, 11, and so on. Okay. You can see that we started with 1, we added 5 numbers to 1, and 6, 11, 16, and so on. Okay. And now, there is another way of writing this. Instead of I equals I plus 1, we can say that use I plus equal 5. What is the meaning of this? It means that every time add 5 items to I, okay? Or you can say I minus equal 5. So this is going to have the same effect. Let's give it a try. Yes, you see, it's exactly the same thing. Now, is that it? To make it a bit more complicated, we can also have a function here. For example, I'm going to write a function here that is going to be static, and it returns an int, an integer. It's called iteration or iterate, and our function is going to receive an argument of the type integer. We call it x, and it returns, what does it return? It returns x by 2. Okay, so if you don't know what a function is yet, don't worry. So far you have learned a lot about for loops, you know enough. And but if you want to understand functions, there are other videos you can watch on my channel. But for now, a function is a set of instructions extracted from the code or separated or isolated from the code so that you can use them many times. So anytime I want to multiply a number by 2, I just use, instead of using this part over and over in my code, I just use the name of the function and give it a number of x, just like this. Instead of I plus equal 5, I write I equals, and I write the name of my function here. I iterate, and it needs an argument. I give it I. So what is it going to do? I is going to be transferred into the function, multiplied by 2, and returned as a result and placed in I. So this is what I can do with a function. Instead of using an assignment, I'm using a function. So you see the result is that 1, okay, we give it 1 because it is initialized by 1. 1 is given as, and the for loop is done once. We go through the loop once. Then again, we come back to the iteration. Iteration needs a function. Okay, it transfers I to the function. 1 is multiplied by 2. Then it returns 2. Now I is 2, right? For the third time that we are going through the loop, I is 2, I is multiplied by 2, and it becomes 4. 4 is printed. Then again it becomes 8, 16, 32, 64, and since the next number is greater than 100, it is not printed because we don't go through the loop again. Okay, so we can use functions here. We can use methods here. And okay, there are a few more things you need to know about a for loop. You don't need to define this variable inside the loop. You don't have to. It's your choice. You can do it here. For example, we say int I is an integer because we have defined it before the loop. We can use it in the loop. So, but if we don't have this line, we'll get an error. It doesn't recognize I as a variable. So we say that there is this variable I, we use it in the loop, and that's it. It works the same way. Okay, as you remember, I told you that this part, the initializer, happens only once. Just the first time that we enter the for loop, it happens once. We never come here again, okay? Now I'm going to show you how it works. You know, beside the default instructions of a for loop, you can add more instructions. For example, besides I equals 1 as the initializer, I can have another some more lines in the initializer. For example, like console write line, and we say that this is from the initializer. Okay, this is from the initializer. And so we are going to go through the loop for Okay, let's just make it simple again. I plus plus. Okay, we're going to go through the loop for 100 times, but the initializer happens only once. Let's see. Okay, if we go to the top, we see that this is from the initializer and it happened only once, though the loop went on for 100 times. What if I remove this chunk of code from here and add it after the iteration? So after the iteration, I can have more code. And this time, this is from the iteration. Let's see what happens this time. Okay, after every single time we went through the loop, we came back to the iteration and performed all the code in the iteration, and then again to the loop, again to the iteration, and again to the loop. So this is what the loop is: once the iteration, once the loop. So whatever code you put over here, you can repeat as many times as you want. Okay, but let's make it simple again. Okay, here we are. But what if for example, imagine this scenario in which you are looking for a name through a list of names and you want to get out of the loop as soon as you find the name. Then you can use break. Okay, a break breaks a loop and gets out of the loop wherever you are. So if I just run this, if you run this, you can see that it happens only once. Okay, number 1 was printed and we got out of the loop because we used the instruction break here. We initialize, the condition is true, we go through the loop, print one number, and we break and get out of the for loop. And the next code over here, if I put a code over here, that will be printed. Right line after the loop. Okay. So if I run the code, we'll print 1 and the for loop will be finished and we print after the loop. We're going to do it later, but what is the benefit of this? If I use this break with an if condition, okay, that would be more beneficial. For example, if I say if I equals 12, then break the loop. Okay, break the loop only if break the loop only if I equals 12. So how many numbers are we going to print here? 1 to 12, because right after we print number 12, I equals 12, we have our condition true and the code break will be performed and we get out of the loop. So you see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 to 12, and then we come to this point. This is the point that prints after the loop. And one more thing about loops is that you can have many for loops inside each other. Let's see how that works. So let's make it simple. Okay, I will change this one to 10. So I'll have numbers 1 to 10 as I. And here inside the for loop, I define another loop, and this time instead of I use j as the variable as our counter. Okay, j equals 1, and keep this going while j is smaller or equal to 10, and add one item to j every time you go through the loop. Okay, and what are we going to do? We are going to design the multiplication table here. Okay, so we start with console dot write. I'm not going to use write line, and I will tell you what's the difference between write and write line is. Write, whenever you use write, you do not finish the line, and you don't go to the end of the next to the beginning of the first line. When you use write, console.write, when you finish the line, you don't go back to the beginning of the next line. You just keep writing. But when you use write line, that means the line is finished and you have to go back to the beginning of the next line. Okay, so we don't want to go back to the beginning of the next line. I'll just use write, and a dollar sign will say, okay, okay, when you use the dollar sign, you are not using a simple string. This is a dynamic string. So inside our string, I want to get the value of I. That's why I use the dollar sign here, and inside the curly braces, I'll get the value of I, and outside the curly braces, whatever I write is a simple string. Okay, so I say I multiplied by j, and an equal sign, or let's not use the spaces here, that would be more clear. And then inside curly braces again, I multiplied by j is the result, and we need some space here. Okay, and so here we are going to print 10 times. The j loop happens for 10 times, and the I loop happens for 10 times. So how many times is this line of code going to be repeated? It's 10 by 10, that's 100 times. Okay, so we are going to print this part of code 100 times, and every time j goes from 1 to 10, and when it becomes 1 again, we go back to the I loop, and one number is added to I. So I is 1, j is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I is 2, j is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I is 3, and j is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So we go through this loop like 100 times. And after every time that we print this line, after every 10 times that we print this line, I has to be added by 1. Okay, and we want to go to the beginning of the next line. That's why we write console.write line. That's it. Okay, this part of code simply brings us to the beginning of the next line. Now let's see if it works properly. Here, This is our multiplication table, and that's how multiple for loops work inside each other. Thank you for watching the video. For more videos about programming, please subscribe and click the little bell button. Thank you for watching.